Part 3. How skills cross from one limb to the other and how far this whole principle can reach. We've saved some of the most surprising material for last, the findings that tend to make students sit up and say, "Wait, really?" Part 3 has two big movements. The first is bilateral transfer, also called cross-education or intermanual transfer. The well-documented, almost unbelievable fact that once you've learned a skill with one hand or foot, the opposite limb, which never practiced at all, can perform it better too. We'll look at the cleanest demonstration of it, ask the practical question of which limb you should train first, and dig into why a skill would cross the body at all, a question that pulls together the cognitive and motor control theories we've already met and even takes us into the brain itself. The second movement zooms all the way out. Learning how to learn says that practicing many different tasks doesn't just build those specific skills, it builds general strategies for learning itself, strategies that transfer to brand new skills you've never seen. And transfer across domains, our closing idea, shows the principle reaching past motor skills entirely. We'll see how a milestone as basic as crawling can ripple outward to reshape an infant's perception, spatial cognition, memory, and even emotional life. So Part 3 travels from one limb to the whole person to the entire span of development, the chapter's widest lens, and a fitting place to end because it shows that transfer isn't a narrow laboratory curiosity. It's one of the deepest organizing principles of how living things learn. Let's start with that untrained hand.
This next phenomenon genuinely surprises students, so let me set it up carefully. Bilateral transfer, also called intermanual transfer or cross-education, is the well-documented finding that once you've learned a skill with one hand or foot, you can learn it more easily with the opposite limb. The skill crosses over to a limb that never practiced it. This isn't new or shaky science, by the way. T.W. Cook published a whole series of articles on cross-education back in the 1930s, and the phenomenon was studied so thoroughly from the 1930s through the 1950s that researchers eventually stopped asking whether it happens and moved on to why. The cleanest demonstration is Mark Latash's 1999 study with his own undergraduates. The task was mirror writing a sentence while looking only in a mirror, which scrambles the normal link between your movements and what you see, so it's genuinely hard. And notice, exactly the kind of situation where you'd expect negative transfer, not help. Students practiced 15 times a day, 5 days a week, for 3 weeks. That's 225 trials. But here's the key, with the dominant hand only. The non-dominant hand never touched the task during all that practice. Yet on the post-test, that untrained non-dominant hand wrote about 40% faster and made roughly 43% fewer errors than at the start. Something learned on one hand had clearly, measurably transferred to the other. Hold on to that result, because the next two slides ask the obvious follow-ups. If you're going to train both sides, which do you start with? And how on earth does a skill jump across the body at all?
Latash's result raises a genuinely practical question. If you're going to train both limbs, does it matter which one you start with? There are two logical possibilities, and they have names. Symmetric transfer would mean it makes no difference. Transfer is equal whichever limb goes first. Asymmetric transfer means one starting limb yields more transfer than the other. This question matters for two distinct reasons. Theoretically, the answer tells us something about whether the two cerebral hemispheres play similar or different roles in controlling movement. Practically, it tells a coach or a therapist which limb to train first, a real decision they have to make. And the generally accepted conclusion in the research is that bilateral transfer is asymmetric, with the recommendation for most teaching and rehabilitation situations being clear: start with the preferred limb. Train the strong, dominant side first, then move to the weaker, non-preferred side. Two reasons support this. One, it fits the bulk of the experimental evidence. And two, a very human reason that's easy to overlook. Starting with the preferred limb produces early success, and that early success keeps the learner motivated to push on through to proficiency with the harder, non-preferred side. There's a lovely applied version of this in your text. Weeks, Wallace, and Anderson trained people to use an upper limb prosthetic simulator by having them practice with the intact limb first, and the benefit transferred to the prosthesis-wearing arm, a genuine rehabilitation strategy built directly on bilateral transfer. Theory and motivation pointing the same way.
So why does a skill cross limbs at all?
Two explanations, and they'll feel familiar because they echo the theories we already met in Part 2. The cognitive explanation says what transfers is the limb-independent what to do, the knowledge you build in the very first stage of learning. Things like the arm-leg opposition principle in throwing, keeping your eyes on the target, following through. None of that is specific to your right or left side. Practice with one limb stores that know-how once, and the other limb simply inherits it. Notice that's basically Thorndike's identical elements idea applied across your own two hands. The motor control explanation goes deeper into the machinery. Under generalized motor program theory, the specific muscles are just a parameter you plug into the program, not a fixed part of it, so the program is effector independent. And from a dynamical systems view, what you learn is an abstract representation of the coordination, not a limb-specific recipe. In fact, people who learn a new relative phase pattern with their arms can transfer it to their legs. The brain backs all of this up beautifully. Going back to studies as old as 1942, when one limb works, EMG recordings show motor commands leaking out to the other limbs. The most to the opposite arm, less to the same side leg, least to the diagonal. And modern fMRI ties cross-hand transfer to the supplementary motor area. It's more active when the untrained hand performs well. And when researchers temporarily knock the SMA offline with transcranial magnetic stimulation, bilateral transfer vanishes. The verdict the authors reach is the satisfying one. Both cognitive and motor factors are genuinely involved. It's not either or, it's both. Now, two of the biggest ideas in the chapter, and they're beautiful ones to build toward the end on. First, learning how to learn. It's almost the opposite of the specificity principle, which says learning is tightly tied to the exact task and context you practiced. Learning how to learn says something more hopeful. Practice enough genuinely different kinds of tasks, and you start extracting general principles about learning itself, strategies that transfer to brand new skills you've never even seen. Think about the successful student. They don't usually succeed by hauling specific facts from one class straight into the next. They succeed because they've learned how to approach an unfamiliar subject, how to take good notes, how to budget study time, how to prepare for an exam, how to ask for help. If learning is really a form of problem solving, as Bernstein argued, then you get better at problem solving by doing a lot of it, whatever the specific problems happen to be. Harry Harlow first named this back in 1949. He called them learning sets, based on watching animals get progressively faster at solving whole classes of new problems. And Seidler showed in 2007 that this ability survives into older age. Older adults who practiced many task variations on day 1 then adapted faster to completely new variations on day 2. So varied practice doesn't only teach skills, it teaches the meta skill of learning. And that's a capability worth cultivating deliberately in anyone you coach, teach, or treat, because it pays off long after they leave you. And here's the most jaw-dropping reach of the entire transfer principle from Joseph Campos and colleagues: transfer across domains. We tend to assume, almost without thinking, that learning a motor skill only affects other motor skills. Not so. When an infant first learns to crawl, it sets off what these researchers literally call a psychological revolution. Broad, measurable changes in perception, in spatial cognition, in memory, and in social and emotional functioning. Sit with that for a second. Learning to move yourself across a room rewires how you understand the world. And the explanation is subtle and important. It isn't crawling per se that does it. It's the flood of brand new experiences that self-produced movement suddenly makes possible. Once you can go to things, reach things, and leave a parent's side, your entire relationship to the environment changes, and your mind reorganizes around that new freedom. The implication is profound and a little sobering for anyone headed into pediatrics, adapted physical education, or early intervention. When a physical disability holds back a child's motor development, some of the non-motor deficits we later observe, in perception or cognition, may actually trace back to those missed movement experiences, not to the disability directly. That's a powerful, hopeful argument for keeping every child moving, by whatever means, as early as we possibly can. Because in development, motor experience is never only motor.
Let's recap Part 3 before we pull the whole chapter together. Bilateral transfer, or cross-education, means practicing with one limb speeds learning in the other. Remember Latasha's untrained hand that got about 40% faster and far more accurate at mirror writing without ever practicing? That transfer is generally asymmetric, so the practical rule is to train the preferred limb first, both because the evidence supports it and because early success keeps learners motivated. Two explanations account for it: the limb-independent what to do on the cognitive side and an effector-free motor program on the motor control side, and both have real neural support, from EMG outflow to other limbs all the way to the supplementary motor area, which TMS studies show is necessary for the effect. And finally, learning how to learn and transfer across domains together show just how far this principle reaches. Varied practice yields general strategies that generalize across the entire lifespan, and a skill as basic as crawling can reshape an infant's whole mind. From one limb to the whole learner to the sweep of development, that's the range of a single idea.
To bring it all home, I had a few summary infographics made. Each one frames this entire chapter for a different professional you might become, so you can see the science wearing the clothes of your future job. This first one is the instructor's view. Trace what it's actually saying. Design for positive transfer by sequencing skills simple to complex, and by deliberately matching components between practice and the real task. That's Thorndike and Gentile in action. Match the processing demands too, so that practice taxes the same thinking the test will require. Navigate the negative transfer trap by anticipating the familiar stimulus different response situations and warning learners before they hit them. And exploit the bilateral advantage by training the preferred limb first. As you scan it, notice something satisfying. Every single recommendation on this sheet traces straight back to a principle we earned together today. There is nothing decorative here. Nothing you'd have to take on faith. It's our whole chapter, reorganized as a practical checklist for someone standing in front of a class. If you remember the reasoning behind each line, you don't just have a list of tips. You have the understanding to adapt them when a real learner does something the list didn't predict.
This second sheet is the coach's playbook, the very same science translated to the field, the court, and the game. Watch how the abstract ideas become concrete coaching choices. Match the components and match the processing. Stop being theory and turn into decisions about how you structure a drill. Does this drill rehearse the actual movements and the actual decisions the athlete will face on Saturday? The ultimate transfer test, the playbook reminds you, is simply the competition itself, which is transfer-appropriate processing wearing a tracksuit. And the identical elements versus processing distinction sits right there in the middle, framed not as a dry academic debate, but as two practical lenses a coach can switch between when a skill isn't carrying over to games. Notice how the negative transfer guidance shows up as patience with athletes retooling a technique for a higher level, and the bilateral idea shows up as smart limb sequencing. The point I most want you to take from this card is that good coaching isn't a bag of tricks handed down by tradition, it's applied motor learning. When you understand why practice like you play works, you can invent your own drills that honor it instead of just copying someone else's. And this third one is for the clinic, a therapist's guide to transfer of learning. Notice the bridge metaphor sitting in the center, because it captures the whole job. Transfer is literally what connects clinical practice on one bank to a patient's real life, at home, at work, in the community, on the other. Everything we covered is folded into this one picture and pointed straight at rehabilitation. The three types of transfer are there, reminding you that a familiar home setting can summon an old, unsafe movement. The two theories are there, telling you to match both the components and the processing of the activities your patient actually needs to do. Simple to complex sequencing with Gentile's taxonomy is there, guiding the progression of a plan of care. The test context principle is there. Judge recovery by function in daily life, not by performance in the clinic. And the preferred limb advantage is there, shaping how you stage bilateral retraining. For those of you headed into physical or occupational therapy, this sheet is worth photographing because it shows that the dry-sounding principles from today are, in the clinic, the difference between a patient who performs in your gym and a patient who actually goes home and lives. That gap is exactly what transfer is about. So let's land the plane with the three things I most want you to carry out of this room. The durable core, long after the specific studies fade. First,
Prior learning is never neutral. It always helps, hurts, or does nothing. So sequence your skills simple to complex. Build the foundations before the complex skills that depend on them. And always judge your practice by the transfer test, never by how polished things happen to look during practice itself. Second, similarity drives transfer, in both of its forms. Shared components and shared cognitive processing both promoted. And while negative transfer is real, it is rare and temporary. An early-stage bump you can predict, explain, and coach a learner through without letting it cost them their motivation. And third, skills cross limbs, and they generalize. Train the preferred limb first, and never forget that varied practice teaches us how to learn, and that a single motor skill can ripple outward to reshape the whole person, as crawling reshapes an infant's mind. Master transfer, and you stop merely running drills and filling time. You start designing learning that actually shows up when and where it matters, in the game, in the test, in real life. That is the entire point of practice. And honestly, it's the whole game of our profession. Thanks, everyone. Go design some transfer, and I'll see you next time.